So I was reading this book called Slow Theology, and in it talks about a time in the U.S. where farmers would prepare for a winter storm by tying a rope between the house and the barn. And the reason for that being is when storms get really bad in the Midwest, there's zero visibility. So if you're at your barn and a blizzard hits, you have very little chance of finding home, just because of the fact that you can't see anything. You could wander around for hours, and you could be within just a few feet of your home, and you could never find your home. So I couldn't actually find specific pictures of that, but what I did encounter was this incident that occurred, I think in Oklahoma, called the Schoolhouse Blizzard of 1888, where there's this huge blizzard that blew off the roof of a schoolhouse. And this brave teacher, to get her students home, just tied a rope to them and made sure to lead them home. And so I started thinking about this need for us as Christians, because sometimes life seems pretty chaotic, visibility seems like it's zero, that we need some sort of rope that when things get crazy will lead us home. And so one of the things that kept the early church on track, the rope that kept the church grounded when it would lose its way, or when there was too much persecution, or when there was confusion, one of the ropes they held on to were these creeds. And one of the creeds was called the Nicene Creed. So I'm not going to read it, but one of the things that I found so interesting about it is that the way the sentences start when you actually recite these creeds is, "We believe." We believe. Some versions of it say, I believe this, I believe this. But as the church, when they recite it, they would say, we believe. And so what I just was reminded of is, as much as these things, these creeds were ropes to keep the church grounded, what was actually behind it was a community that would not just say, I believe, but that we as a group believe. So we've been talking about community as a spiritual discipline, as a practice that our Rabbi Jesus did, and maybe something that we could consider doing. Someone said this: faith is never a solo act. We are always in the company of the church. When we pray, when we worship, when we confess our faith, faith is not precarious because it does not depend on us. When our faith is weak, someone else's is strong. We are carried by the great company of saints, all who believe in Jesus. Faith is a community project. So the reason why our faith continues to grow and keep going, the reason why God's kingdom continues to spread, is not because there's one individual leading the charge. It's not because there's charismatic leaders leading the charge. The reason why God's church is able to survive and thrive is actually because this is a community project. That even though I may feel spiritually weak, even though I may want to stop walking, I may want to stop running, I may want to stop fighting the good fight, someone else is going to keep the project moving forward. And so that's why we talked about last few weeks. One of the things that Jesus left his church as a tradition was a meal. One of the things that Jesus left his church was a table, to organize our lives around the table, sharing meals, celebrating together, worshiping together, praying together around a table. Jesus did not leave a liturgy. He left the Lord's Prayer, but he did not leave a liturgy. Jesus did not leave a blueprint for what a perfect church structure could look like. Jesus left a table. Professor Joseph Hellerman talks about how unlikely it is that the early church survived the Roman Empire that was trying to crush them. How could this small group of people survive the Roman Empire? Here's what he says: Christians had no temples, no sacrifices, no priesthood, no liturgy, just an informal weekly meeting in a local home where they broke bread and sang a hymn. This is hardly the stuff of a major world religion. That's all Christians had at the beginning. Not a liturgy, not places to meet like this, not a music team, not necessarily a consistent speaker preaching the word. All they had was an informal gathering around a meal to share life together, and that meal changed the world. Think about that. A simple meal, informal meal, gathering together in community, that practice changed the world because it grew and it grew and it grew. And people experienced the love of God through that, not through church service, through community. So last week we talked about practicing community by sharing in each other's joy, right? In other words, we as a church need to make a conscious effort to celebrate together, to celebrate one another, to celebrate what God is doing. Matthew 26. This is towards the end. Verse 30. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Verse 36, then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to the disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. Think about this. Jesus is about to face the cross. What does he do? He sings a hymn. What does that mean? Jesus is about to encounter one of the most difficult parts of his life, but yet he celebrates in community even in the midst of a difficult season, right? Even in community, right? We are called to celebrate. But he did one other thing. What did he do? He shared his pain. He shared his burdens. He didn't hide his sadness. It says he was troubled. He didn't hide his distress. He shared it. And so much of what we can do to build a deeper community is sharing the joys. But today I want to talk about how we can build a deeper community by actually sharing in our sorrows. A big deal is made, rightfully so, about how Jesus is fully human. And to be fully human means that we are okay and allowed to feel sorrow, and we are okay to feel fear, and we are okay to feel distress. That's why in Isaiah 53, here's how Isaiah 53 describes Jesus. He was despised and rejected by man. Look at that. A man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. We would not like to think of the Son of God as feeling sorrow or being acquainted with grief, but that's exactly how Isaiah describes him. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. To be fully human, is to feel sorrow, is to feel grief, is to feel fear, is to feel distress. But we're not meant to feel it alone. That's why God gave Adam Eve, right? He needed a helper. So a few weeks ago, I also shared about when Jesus called his disciples, he called them to be with him. And that's kind of crazy, right? That the God of the universe calls a family around him just to hang out with him, to be with him. He's calling a family so he could spend time with them. And the way I pictured that was always as this one-way relationship, that Jesus calls a family so he could pour into them, so he could disciple them, so he could teach them, so he could show them and transform them. It was this one-way relationship where us being with Jesus means that Jesus gives to us. But what we see in the scene of Gethsemane, what Jesus is modeling, is it's actually not just this one-way thing where Jesus is giving. Community requires that we receive. Community requires that we put our burdens on others. That Jesus said, I want company, I want support. Not that he needs it, but maybe that he's modeling it. That in community, I invite support into my sorrows, into my grief, into my pain, into my fear. So he calls his inner circle, his closest friends, not just to share the highs and the joys, but actually to share the lows. We are not meant to carry our burdens and sorrows alone. Right? I don't have verses for this, but John 16 says, in this world, we're gonna have tribulation. To be human and to exist in a fallen world means we will face pain and sorrows. But then Galatians says, carry each other's burdens. You're going to have sorrows. You're going to have pain, but we are called to carry each other's burdens. Hebrews chapter 10. Verse 24 through 25 says, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. We tend to focus on the first parts of this, that we are to gather and we are to stir one another to love and good works. We are to gather. So it's important that we gather together. But what do we miss? The second part, we gather to encourage one another. Why? We would not need encouragement if life was just full of joys. We wouldn't need it. But the fact that Hebrews tells us we need to encourage each other tells us that life is full of sorrows. So we don't just meet to sing. We don't just meet to study the Bible. We don't just meet to have communion. We meet to encourage each other because we carry around sorrow. We carry around grief. Last week I talked about the 3 layers of conversation by Jonathan Eldridge, right? And he talks about the shallows, which is just chit-chat, and then the midlands, and then the depths. And we as a community obviously want to move when appropriate, not just to shallow conversation, not just to mid-level conversation, but really be vulnerable and get to the depths. But here's the thing. When somebody asks you, how was your day? You need to be ready to be vulnerable. And that person needs to be ready to receive something other than just, it's going okay, if you need it at that time. We need to share our wounds and our trauma. We all have some form of trauma. We do. We don't want to admit it, but we all have some form of trauma. Someone defined it this way: trauma is not necessarily what happens to you, but how your body processes what happens to you, right? Trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside as a result of what happens to you. It's not the event. So let's break it down this way. Some event happens that is a threat. Your body mounts some sort of defense. Sometimes it's the fight or flight response, or sometimes it's just sort of freezing response, right? But your body responds to some event. When that event passes, the threat, your body should discharge that stress. Okay? Ideally, when that event is done, your body should be able to discharge the energy of fight or flight or freezing and reach this baseline level of safety. If that happens, trauma does not stay. But sometimes what happens is the cycle of feeling threatened, your body responding to the threat and being emotionally ready to handle the threat, and then when the threat is gone, decompressing, sometimes that cycle gets interrupted. And that feeling of threat, that feeling of danger, that feeling of hurt gets internalized. That is when trauma sticks. I remember driving in California after a church retreat, and I was driving down a mountain road. And it was snowing. And people are like, should we put on chains? Of course, I said, nah. We don't need to put on tire chains. I know how to drive in the snow. So what inevitably happens? We come to a curve, the car skids off the road, hits a snowplow. The snowplow driver looks at me, I look at the snowplow driver, and then I just kind of keep going, right? But so the threat, in my mind, like, it was pretty traumatic though, right? Because the feeling of not having control is really traumatic. I turn the wheel this way, I expect the car to go this way, but the car goes that way. That feeling of losing control, I mean, that's a life analogy, right? You want to steer your life this way, it goes that way. That's very, very traumatic. And so I did not realize, a few weeks later, I'm driving, and I didn't realize that fear and that feeling of threat stayed inside me. I never let it out. And so even when I'm driving on just normal roads for a few weeks and I'm turning the car, in me was this trauma of, is the car going to turn? Is the car going to turn? Am I going to skid out? Right? That's exactly how trauma works. There's a biological signal that should tell my brain that the danger is over and that energy gets released, but that is not what ended up happening, and so trauma kicked in. So they started studying trauma and this idea of how can two people go through the same experience and one comes out traumatized and one actually comes out stronger. Okay, listen, right? How can it be that two people experience the same event, one can be destroyed by that event or that season, and someone else actually comes out stronger? So here's what they found. They found that it had nothing to do with the type of event that you experienced. Two people could experience the same event. It doesn't matter what the event was. What determined whether someone would come out of it with trauma versus someone come out of it with growth was actually if that person had a community around them. That's it. If someone had a community through which to process the trauma, they would come out stronger. If someone was isolated and just dealing with the trauma, they would come out damaged. So we need to share our trauma. Trauma, someone said, I don't have a slide for this, it's just emotional pain that has yet to find a relational home. If you do not share your emotional pain in the context of a relationship, it's going to live, it's going to thrive, it's going to grow, it's going to eat at you, it's going to paralyze you. So we are called to share our trauma. We're also called to share our fears, right? If trauma is based on what happened in the past, fears is what's potentially going to happen in the future. And you know, fears are actually harder to deal with because they're unknown. Trauma, you can pinpoint. You can say, I went through this is why I feel this way. Fears is irrational because it's projecting into something that may or may not actually happen. I don't know when it's going to happen. I'm just scared it's going to happen. I don't know if it actually has a possibility of happening, but I just have this fear about it. It's unknown and it's uncertain. Do you know there's always people, you probably know people, maybe you're that person that's always anxious about everything and you're like, what if this, what if that, what if that? And you're just like that panic-driven person. Those people should be welcomed in a community. And if you're that person, you should be willing to share your fears, even though it might get annoying, because you got to unload that. It's not meant to be handled alone. So kind of a big picture here is how we're meant to practice community and use it as a discipline is allowing other people in our lives as a form of support. Allowing other people in our lives as a form of support. Think about the seasons we've gone through at this church. The only reason we're still, or one of the reasons why we're still here, I think, is because during difficult seasons, we came together to support. Right? We went through a whole time where we decompressed, where we processed, where we shared. And I think in that sharing, it kept this community and actually grew this community to be closer and to be stronger because we allowed other people to be a form of support in our spiritual life. But there's also areas in this church that in the past we have lacked support. And specifically in areas related to ministries and passions people had. Because people would have had passions and ministry, and they didn't know who to share that with. They didn't know who to partner with. I have this idea. Who do I go to? Who can support me? And we didn't know how to keep it going. And maybe we'd do one thing and then it would stop. Okay? But one of the things that's one of the things that I think was identified in the past year is there's really not this system where someone who needs support, not just in joys, not just in pains, but also in ministry ideas, could find that support. And so with that, as you know, we have called Jeff into partly that role. So I'm going to ask Jeff a little bit to share about how he sees him as a person whom we can share our burdens, ideas with, process with, those kind of things. So more of an administrative but also spiritual support, not just for joys and sorrows. So can we welcome up Jeff?
Leo just asked me to come up and share a little bit about what my role is and what my role entails. So officially, I am the Director of Operations here at Pearl. And as you can see, I didn't come up with any notes, anything pre-prepared. Because for me, as I was thinking about my role and what I would do here, my natural inclination would just be to kind of share about how we would kind of take our church vision, define it, be able to talk about our values, build a system around that, be able to create processes and goals that we could do to be able to grow the church, think about how we can, increase our numbers, make things more efficient, maximize our kind of limited human and financial resources. Those are all things that I think for me would have been very natural to talk about. Because I think for me, I'm naturally a very strategic, and I think more along the kind of big picture macro things. But I think the reason why I didn't want to talk too much about that in terms of my role is because exactly what we've been kind of sharing these last few weeks about community. Because when I look at what it means for us to be a community, and just even what Leo was talking about today, there's all these things that we can do, these plans. We can try to steer things this way. We can say, oh, we need to build this structure around this church. We can implement all these ministries. We can, just have the perfect plan. But if there is not community, if there's not this relationship with God, then those things will go awry. Because we can do the best we are as, the way that I see it is we're meant to be planters. So we can plant these seeds, we can cultivate the land, but God is really the one that makes it grow. And so that's kind of how I envisioned as I've been kind of thinking about this role. Because I think if you ask me or anybody in the DB right now, like, oh, what is Jeff's kind of role here at Pearl? All of us would kind of say, like, oh, we're just kind of figuring it out right now. We're going to kind of seeing how it goes as it goes along, right? And so, yes, I think it's important for us to have all these structures and plans in place, but ultimately, for me, I think the difficult thing is, this is something that doesn't come naturally to me, is looking at things in terms of relationships and community. And as we've been going through this series, it's really been speaking to me in terms of how we can cultivate that. And, we can try to do all the things that we can, but ultimately what it comes down to is how we operate with each other. Because when we distill it down, really the goal of what we do here is a relationship between us and God, and us with one another, how God impacts our lives, and we become a community that will walk with God to support each other, to encourage one another, and ultimately those around us, our coworkers, the city around us, the people that we meet on the street. And so when I start to think about things in those terms of what it looks like to build community, I think ultimately what I landed on is I want to be someone who is able to support and to share in those joys and those sorrows. So I think the first thing that I kind of did coming in is I really wanted to be a learner. I think the natural inclination, especially for a lot of pastors or a lot of people who come into positional leadership, is say, okay, well, these are things that has worked for this place that I was before, or these are things that I've learned in seminary or whatever, and I'm going to kind of bring it in and implement it, right? And these are the things that's going to work to help to get us to the next level. But for me, I think I wanted to just come in and I wanted to learn what it is, what makes this community what it is. And even though I've kind of been a part of this community for a long time, I think coming into this position, it's kind of changed my perspective a little bit. So I started off by meeting with each of the DB members individually, and just not just to see kind of like, oh, what it is you do here, how can I help you, but also just how are things going? Like, what are the things that we've been going through as a church? What's the temperature like, for you right now? And what I've gotten back has been not really what I expected. So a lot of them would share their joys with me, just how encouraged they've been by how we've weathered difficult times here as a community. Just the amazing ways that God has blessed them personally and professionally in their family lives. And that's been really encouraging to see here. But also the other side of it is they shared a lot of their struggles with me, a lot of the difficult times that they've been going through in their lives, a lot of the challenges that they're facing, in their professional lives, in their busyness, and how that affects how they lead the church. And so I think it's so applicable what Leo's been sharing these past few series, just what it looks like for us to be a community. And so I think ultimately what I feel like my role here is to just try to, and I think you'll hear this a lot the more you hear me talk, is I really am all about balance, right? And so while I feel like there's incredible value in terms of the strategic and the structural and the organizational aspects, I think that all feeds into what we are trying to accomplish in this community is about relationship. And it's about how we can deepen our relationship with God, deepen our relationship with each other, and ultimately what that will lead us to do as a church. Because as we were praying this morning, I know somebody was praying, just kind of, saying like, we were kind of in this period of coming out of the wilderness. They're going through a lot of stuff, and now we're stabilized. But in the sense that it feels like we might be stagnant in a way in terms of our growth as a church. And so just praying for growth and for more people to come. But ultimately, I think just what Leo was teaching today about what the church looks like. It wasn't just can you throw out that slide, by the way, Joy, the kind of the second slide about church? The one about the early church. Sorry to put you under pressure. That's maybe the third or fourth slide. But anyways, it's basically there's no temple, there's no sacrifice and priesthood. So there was not this structure that the early church had. It was just this gathering of people where they shared life together, and this is what actually caused the church to grow. And so that's what I'm hoping to do is as I support this church is I want to be an encouragement to the people around us. I want to do what I can to empower people, to feel confident in serving, to be able to do what I can to help make this place a home, a place where we can feel like we belong here, and when newcomers come in, that they feel like they've arrived at a place where that can feel as home too. Because I know that ultimately our plans and our goals and all that stuff is not what's going to change us or change this city, but it's really the relationships in the community that's going to make all this stuff happen. So sorry if that was kind of rambling, but I hope that gives you a picture of what my heart is for this and what I hope to be able to bring to Pearl. I'll kind of give it back to Leo.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so we've been at this place where we didn't know who to turn to for support when we had ministry ideas. And hopefully Jeff's role is just one way of God using his giftings and talents to bring us together. All right, so just in closing, I realize there's so many forces and so many reasons we have that keep us actually alone and isolated in our grief and our sorrow. And we have very real griefs, very real pain, but it's so easy to be isolated, whether it's fear of embarrassment or fear of judgment, or maybe there have been past experiences where you've shared openly and it hasn't gone so well. The response was not what you needed or what you expected. But we also just have to recognize that when we don't share our sorrows and joys, it's just this wound that never gets a chance to heal because it's never exposed to the light. And with the mechanism that God gave us to live that out, as Jeff said, is community. It's a table. I keep coming back to this. Jesus left us a meal as a way to practice our faith together, and that meal changed the world. God's truth exercised in community around a tiny table or large table just in the middle of a Roman courtyard changed the world. That's how critical it is to live in community and to be able to share our joys, but also our pains and our griefs. So just by way of discussion, Okay, here are the questions. And I'll just let you read through them, reflect on them a little bit, and then I'll pray, and then we'll share.